Okay, I'm going to begin here. Today, I want to talk about the five great themes of the Hebrew prophets. I did two previous classes that had to do with Bible prophecy. I think I call them When Prophecy Fails. And that's the way people normally think of prophecy, predicting the future, maybe even calculating the future, trying to come up with dates or scenarios of the end times. So I want to switch from that and actually talk about the original idea of the Hebrew prophets and what is prophecy. Many of you know that if you take, I've got my Bible here, just a normal RSV Bible that I use all the time. It's got the Old Testament, so called New Testament, and Apocrypha, and it's a study Bible. I remember growing up as a kid in the church, Church of Christ, learning that it's law, history, poetry, and prophecy. And that's actually the way the books are arranged. And when you use that arrangement, Daniel is in the prophets. But the Hebrew Bible, as many of you know, is arranged differently. It's in three parts. First of all, the Torah or the law, and then the Nevi'im, the prophets, that are not Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel as a beginning, but actually Joshua, Judges, and so forth. And then the writings, the Ketuvim, at the end. Daniel, which everybody thinks would be the quintessential Hebrew prophet, is not included in the Nevi'im. He's in the back of the book, you might say, with Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, or some of the other writings. And the rabbis had questions about Daniel in terms of where to put him. Um, it's kind of similar to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. You know, Revelation, the book, claims to be a revelation of Jesus Christ. So you might want to put it right up front with the Gospels, since it's purports to be teachings of Jesus directly that he's giving, and he speaks in the first person, and yet it's put at the back. And I think it's kind of for the same reason that the idea of Daniel with his visions and his times and different kinds of calculations, the 490 years, the 70 weeks prophecy, and so on, is often considered to be dangerous, maybe, or forbidden territory, or people come up with all kinds of interpretations, as they do with the book of Revelation. And so people often say, don't study Daniel or Revelation, it'll drive you crazy. So I'm not doing any of that today. I actually want to look at what we call the Hebrew prophets, and I want to mainly look at the pre-exilic prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea through Habakkuk, particularly Amos, Micah, and so forth. When you get to after the exile and into the what we call the late Second Temple period, you get a whole lot of materials and ideas and motifs that come in that are not found in that early material. So, what I want to do today is focus on the Hebrew prophets, primarily Jeremiah, Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Micah, those pre exilic Hebrew prophets, and ask what are the five major themes of those prophets? That material, that early material, not so much as predicting the future, but speaking for God, which they claim to do. So you almost could call them the five matters or the five main concerns that you get in the Hebrew prophets. There's what are they really emphasizing? What are they really putting forth in a very strong way? What would be, I'm just going to call them their themes. So I'm going to go over five of them, very varying length on some of them. The first one I'm calling understanding and knowing YHVH, as they call the deity, Yahweh, Jehovah, Hashem, the name. Uh, it means the eternal one, the one who is and was and is to come, the creator. So I'm going to start with Jeremiah 9. I'll read it. Thus says the creator, the eternal. Let not the wise man glory in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man glory in his might. Let not the rich man glory in his riches. So that's very interesting the way it starts. Man, I'm taking as human being here. I'm just reading the RSV. So this is Jeremiah 9:23 through 24. Notice wisdom, the wise man, power or might, and wealth. Those are the values of our world. It's really, really interesting to have knowledge, to have wisdom, to have power to do things, and to have money in order to get that power and control that power. Everything comes from that. And so here in Jeremiah chapter 9, he's admonishing people, and it's given as the words of Jehovah or God, the creator. Don't glory in that. In other words, don't look to that. Don't favor that. Don't make that an important thing. But let him who glories glory in this, that he understands and knows me. Now, this is in the first person, that I am Jehovah, YHVH, doing. The RSV had practicing, but I went to the Hebrew and put doing. It's the verb asah, doing steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth, for in these things I delight, says the Lord or Jehovah. Interesting. Notice the delight at the end. It's hafatz. It means to just be thrilled over, to absolutely love and adore and think something is wonderful. It has the idea of happiness with it. So it's got an emotion to it. And that's how God's presented in the Hebrew prophets. Lots of emotion, particularly in Jeremiah. So what does he say? To understand and know me, that I am Jehovah, doing steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. That is theme number one, to understand and know that what is conveyed in that verse. What we have in the Hebrew Bible, and this is not just the prophets, but I'm going to use the prophets, of course, is this idea of a fivefold description of who God is. It starts in Exodus 34, where Moses wants to know God. He wants to see God. And God reveals his name, the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. And he says, I am Jehovah, I am Yahweh, Yahweh, and Elohim. There's a force of all forces, the eternal one. Now, notice these terms: merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and truth. That's a formula that occurs 7 times with those exact phrases of 5. I'm not going to read them all to you, but here's a couple. Joel 2, verse 13, talking about repentance. Return to Jehovah your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. So there you have just the 4. Jonah 4, verse 2, for I knew that you were a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and repenting of evil. Psalm 86:15. But you, O Adonai, there the name the Lord is used, or the Lords in plural, the Lord of all lords. You are a God, an Elohim, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and truth. Psalm 103. He made known his ways to Moses, that's the psalmist writing, that Yahweh is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Psalm 145:8, Nehemiah 9:17 are the other 2. And they're very, very consistent. Sometimes you have all 5 traits: abounding in steadfast love and truth. Sometimes truth is left out. Sometimes truth is even rendered or translated as faithfulness, but it is the word emet, or truth. If you think of those as characteristics and what Jeremiah says in that opening passage I read, that a person would understand and know me, that I am doing steadfast love, righteousness, and justice. You can see that the beginning principle that you get in the prophets is, who is God? To know God. How is God self-described? And these five traits, used 7 times that exact formula, really stands out. And notice it's in the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. So it's all the way through consistently. It's literally the ID, the self-identification of the creator. So that's the first uh, great theme that comes out in the prophets. Uh, if you go through many, many texts in the prophets, you get words like hesed, which is loving kindness. I'm giving you the Hebrew. Mishpat, which is judgment. That's really making wise and right decisions. Tzedakah, doing the right thing. Emet, being truthful. And then emunah, the idea of faith or trust. Those are the big five: loving kindness, judgment or justice, righteousness, truth, and faithfulness. So that becomes a formula throughout the prophets. And building off of that passage in Jeremiah 9, the plea of Jeremiah is that if people want to understand the message of the Hebrew prophets, that they need to understand and know me. That connects to a second point that I'm going to call the Abrahamic plan. And it comes up again in the prophets. Jeremiah again, sticking with Jeremiah here. This is chapter 4, verse 1. If you return, O Israel, says Jehovah, to me, you should return. And if you swear, as Jehovah lives, meaning you're oriented your life, the idea of swearing by Jehovah in the Hebrew Bible means that you're always aware of that presence, that you're ordering your life according to faith that God lives. And notice what it then says: in truth, in justice, and in righteousness, then nations shall bless themselves in him, and in him shall they glory. So here you have an extension of the idea of truth, justice, and righteousness, 3 of those traits of the 5, that nations then will bless themselves. Now, that's sort of an odd idea. It's actually speaking about Abraham. Many of you will remember Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3. You've actually got this breakdown of 7 elements. Abraham is told to leave his country, his family, and his house, and go to a land that he'll be shown. We call it the Holy Land, the Promised Land today. And then here are the 7 things. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you, I will curse. And here's number 7. And by you, or in you, all the families of the earth. And it's actually the idea of the nations again, that the nations will bless themselves in him. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves. There's some grammar there that I just want to explain. The first 3, I will make of you a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make your name great. Grammatically, there's something called the cohortative. It actually means to exhort. And it's the idea that let me make you a great nation, let me bless you, let me make your name great. It's this idea of urging, or go from your house and your family and your land, and let me do this, and let me do this, and let me do this, so that you'll be a blessing. Well, blessing is okay in English, but then when it says, I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you, curses, actually, that's again, a lot is influenced by the Geneva Bible and the King James Bible, and these translations just continue. But it's actually the verb kalal, and it means to treat lightly. In other words, if anybody thinks this is not of any weight or importance, not necessarily that they turn and curse it with some sort of epithet or something, but they just don't consider the task or mission of Abraham here as important, then that person will be disregarded, arar. That person will not be part of it. But those who are part of it, as it says here, by you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And that's actually shall bless themselves, I think is a better translation. We call that the reflexive. That is, they're going to be able, through this Abrahamic plan, to find good for themselves. So, what is the plan? What is this idea? That's the statement of it, but what is it? In Genesis 18, you get some very similar language. It's one of my favorite verses in Genesis because it has God kind of talking to himself, which I like. And he's actually saying, he's talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it says, and Jehovah said, notice, shall I, he's speaking to himself, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by him. So it's actually a restatement of what you get in Genesis 12, the plan. But here's what I really like how he answers himself. He goes, no, shall I hide from Abraham? No, I'm not going to do that. For I have known him. Now, I think the King James and even the Revised Standard, they say, I've chosen him. They're already trying to get into the idea of the chosen people. And, chosen could be okay, I suppose. But literally, it's yada, to know. I've known him, meaning I've examined his character, what he's all about. And then it goes on to say, I've known him how? That he may charge his children and his household. Please notice the household as well. So, Abrahamic faith is not just the descendants of Abraham, but anybody who joins the household of Abraham. Some people think that's some new Christian idea. This is in the Hebrew Bible. We're going to see it a number of other places. So, he's going to take his children and his household. And what are they going to do? They're going to keep the way of Jehovah by doing righteousness and justice. Now, if you go back to the Jeremiah 9 that I started with, notice he practices or does justice and righteousness in the earth. And in this I delight, and you're supposed to know him. And here you have the way, it's called the way of Jehovah, by doing righteousness and justice, so that Jehovah may bring to Abraham what he's promised him. Well, what has he promised him? It just says in the previous verse that all the nations of the earth will bless themselves in him. So there's something going on here. You've got the nature of God revealed in this language, these five great terms. And now you've got the plan, the Abrahamic plan, in which all the nations are going to get blessings upon themselves. And we'll go into some of that more as we go into the other three. So, what is this way of righteousness and justice? Those are generic terms. You could say, well, what is right? What is just? How does that decide it? There you go to, I think, what are called the 10 words. I don't think they're called that. I think you go to what are called the 10 words. Most people call them 10 commandments. But the 10 matters, the 10 things, the 10 topics, the 10 subjects, they're called in the Hebrew Bible the edut, the testimony. It's actually a kind of self-testimony of God. Here's the testimony that I'm given. But I want to read you what Rabbi Hertz, if you know this book, the Pentateuch and the Haftarahs, I really recommend it. He was the British rabbi of the UK. And he's talking about the 10 commandments, as they're called, or the 10 words. And here's what he says. That revelation was the most remarkable event in the history of humanity. So notice this rabbi, the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, is saying that it's the history of humanity. I have a phrase that I often use, and I know Ross Nichols and others use, Decalogue faith for all the world. In other words, the 10 words, the 10 matters, go back to what Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 9, in these things I delight. And so they're universal. They have to do with who is the creator God, remembering God as creator, particularly with the Sabbath day. But then let me continue reading what Hertz says. It's the birth hour of the religion of the Spirit, which was destined in time to illuminate the souls and order the lives of all the children of men. The Decalogue is a sublime summary of human duties binding upon all mankind, or humankind, I'll call it, a summary unequaled for simplicity, comprehensiveness, and solemnity, a summary which bears divinity on its face and cannot be antiquated as long as the world endures. It is at the same time a divine epitome of the fundamentals of Israel's creed in life, and Jewish teachers, ancient and modern, have looked upon it as the fountainhead from which all Jewish truth and Jewish teaching could be derived. These commandments are written on the walls of the synagogue and the church. They are the world's teachings, he says law, but I'm going to say teachings for all time. So, this idea of breaking down the 10 words or the 10 matters into principles, this is another part of the Abrahamic plan, because if Abraham is going to teach his children and his household this way of the Lord by doing justice and righteousness, you have to break down and define what the way of the Lord is. And that's exactly what he's doing here. So here you have in the prophets, they're repeated many times. Jeremiah 7, will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, and then come into this house and say, we are delivered? You know, we're the chosen ones. And you can see here that would be a breakdown of the plan. Don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't swear falsely, tell the truth. Hosea 4, 1 and 2. There's no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge of God in the land. Notice again, knowledge of God. And what is knowledge of God? There's swearing, lying, killing, stealing, committed adultery. They break all bounds, and murder follows murder. So there you've got a summary, particularly of the things among human beings and human behavior: sexual purity, respecting property, respecting life, respecting language, not swearing. So the Abrahamic plan is that knowledge of God would be translated into some kind of a household of Abraham that would then represent it to the world, so that justice and righteousness could come to the earth. The third emphasis or theme of the prophets is the servant nation. Most people think of it as Isaiah, second Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 40 through 53, but it's also in other places as well. It does occur 20 times in those chapters as you go from 41 to 53, but it's also in Jeremiah and it's other places, and the idea is throughout the prophets. And the idea would be, let me just read you Isaiah 41, 8 through 9. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant, I've chosen you, I will not cast you off. So that's one of the early passages. I think that's the first one, where the people of Abraham, and remember, it can be extended beyond the bloodline of Abraham, but the people of Abrahamic faith, who have the faith of Abraham, are addressed here. And Abraham is called God's friend. It's actually my love, the one I love, the one in whom I'm well pleased. You're my servant, I've chosen you. Now, whenever you say chosen, you have to say chosen for what? And if you look on through the references, the 20 references to this servant nation, there's the idea that there would be a people or a nation or a group that would be representing to the world this way broken down either in the Decalogue, like the Ten Commandments, or these other characteristics of mercy and justice and righteousness and truth and faithfulness and so forth. Isaiah 42, verse 1, behold, my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. Now, there you've got the same thing again in terms of delight, hafatz, to actually feel the emotion of it. This is given in the first person in the prophets. So you're getting the feeling of God speaking. I delight in this, just as any of us would delight in our children growing up and really becoming amazing, upstanding, honest, and good people and leaving the world so much better than had they not been here. I mean, how would a parent not absolutely delight in that? I think any of us that are parents, that's probably the thing we want most on earth. And, one of the analogies of God is a father, a heavenly father that you get throughout the Hebrew Bible and way on into the New Testament, of course. And this idea of having children or offspring of faith that are following this way is part of that Abrahamic plan. Now, let me keep reading. I'll read it again. Behold, my servant. So the servant is the servant nation whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I put my spirit upon him, and he will bring forth justice to the nations. Now, isn't that interesting? The chosenness has to do with the mission of representing this to the world. You've heard of the model UN, and as we know, the UN is not much of a model. And when students do the model UN in colleges and high schools, they try to be more of the model because the charter of the UN is very biblically reflective of these values of the prophets, very much so, justice and equality and so forth. Eleanor Roosevelt had a big part in writing it. And if you've never read the charter of the UN, you might take a look at it. It's like reading parts of the prophets. And outside the UN, you actually have quotations from Isaiah 2 and about the nations beating the swords into plowshares and so forth as they learn the way of the Lord. Well, as you well know, the UN hardly represents justice and righteousness and truth and so forth today, but it's a lot of bickering nations looking after their own interests all too often. But here's the idea that a model nation would have a task of being chosen, and that chosenness would have to do with actually representing to the world uh, what it is to really live the way of God. That it would become an example, as we say, but it's an example that would draw people. And this is going to lead us to the fourth point of how that model nation begins to attract the rest of the world. This is a great theme of the Hebrew prophets. Before I go on, though, I want to mention a book. Some of you know this book, Hugh Schoenfield. I think he wrote it back in the 70s, The Passover Plot, and he got famous for that. I think he pronounced his name Hugh Schoenfield. When I was at the University of Chicago, I corresponded with him. He'd already had the success with this book. I I think everyone should read The Passover Plot. It's a thrill to read, and it has a lot of real good background in it. But as far as the main thesis, I don't buy it, and I think it's kind of a Dan Brown style thriller in that sense. But Schoenfield was a real scholar, and I treasure the letters I have from him. He was getting older, and I was a young graduate student at the University of Chicago, and we wrote these letters back and forth. And I never got to meet him because he passed away, but I really came to love and appreciate him. This book, I think, is his best book, Those Incredible Christians. In fact, when somebody wants to talk to me about Christianity, I tell them, read this book and I'll talk to you. I've told so many students, read Schoenfield, Those Incredible Christians, where you'll get the background, the historical background of Second Temple Judaism. And then we can talk about Christology or who is Jesus or was he the Son of God, the Messiah, whatever. And in the back, he has two appendices, the Christology of Paul and the Christology of John. They're only a few pages. Best thing ever written, clearest thing in short form ever written on how Paul and John begin to deify Jesus and see him as the Savior and the Lord and so forth in a way that maybe he was not. So why would I mention Schoenfield or Schoenfield? Because he has another book that very few people know called The Politics of God. I think it was his last book. I highly recommend it. The title alone might begin to tell you what he's doing. He's saying that God, the Hebrew God, has a political plan to change the world. It's the politics of God. And the politics of God is that this servant, notice it's a servant nation, not a dominating nation. It's a nation that becomes reflective of all the values that represent the nature of God. You see how this is a very tight package of who is God, what is the Abrahamic plan, how is the world going to learn it, and the role of this servant nation. People think of it as a religion and they identify it as an ethnic thing, but it's really a kind of ideal cause that can be taken up by any human being and should be taken up by any human being, because notice the servant brings justice to the nations. And so when the justice comes to the nations, they have their own ways of taking up these banners of justice and truth and righteousness and faithfulness and loving kindness and loyalty and so forth. You see? So it's really an amazing idea. You know, one of the strangest translations in the King James Version of the Bible is in Exodus 19, where God is giving the 10 commandments or the 10 words in chapter 20. And he says to the people at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, I'm going to make you a peculiar people, a chosen nation, a peculiar people. That's the King James. And, you know, all through the 400 or 500 years since the King James and the Geneva Bible before that used that translation from the 1500s on. A lot of groups thought, well, this is a badge of honor. You know, if we can be really weird and different and our clothing will be conservative and we'll be a peculiar people, then that'll really stand out and the rest of the world will look at us and think, boy, they're really peculiar. That's actually the opposite of the idea. The idea is that you would attract the nations by doing justice and righteousness. This goes all the way through the Torah, that the nations are supposed to see the chosen people, the servant Israel, whoever that would be, and they're to say, whoa, what other nation is like this, that lives like this, where there's no lying, no stealing, no murder, where sanctity of life and sexuality is protected, where the words people speak are important and honored and revered. I mean, it would transform the world. Imagine courts. If you ask someone who's accused of a crime, did you do it? And they go, yeah, I did, or no, I didn't. Trial's over. Nobody's going to lie. I mean, it sounds almost silly to us. It sounds almost comical. There was a movie years ago. I liked it. It was British. It was called something like The Invention of Lying. And it kind of imagined a world where people couldn't lie. And then somebody discovered lying. Some of you might have seen that, or you can look it up. It's fun to watch, just to kind of think about these issues. I've got keys all over the place, locks. Thou shalt not steal, financial stealing. Graft is the biggest problem in the world with most governments. Corruption, whether it's business, government, politicians. I mean, we haven't even begun to think about the implications of the 10 Commandments, even though they're in synagogues and churches and recited by people. They are not simple little childlike platitudes. They are major geopolitical realities that would transform the world if they were taken up. Now, according to the prophets, the only way this is going to happen, and I think there's an if to it, if you repent, Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 4, if you return to the Lord and swear in his name, then the nations will bless themselves. But what if you don't? You see, you have the consequences. And that seems to be what we're living with. And so, you know what that word actually is in Hebrew is segulah, just like it sounds, segulah. It means a treasure. In other words, you would be the jewel of the planet because you would be the shining jewel that would be reflecting the justice and righteousness of the Torah or teaching. I'm going to use the word teaching because I'm not talking about a Torah scroll. I'm talking about primarily the testimony of what God is like and how that would translate into human living and human affairs. And so in Exodus 19, rather than a peculiar people, it's a treasured people without whom the world would not go on. What would be the point of the world? Is the world just for people to exercise power and riches and might and oppression and violence and anything they can get away with? Or is it to be a planet or a world in which righteousness and justice prevail? So, this idea of the servant nation is the third theme of the prophets, and it's just all over the place. Isaiah 51, verse 2, look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who bore you. For when he was but one, I called him, and I blessed him and made him many. So, this idea of the people of Abraham, I'm going to say the household of Abraham, people who take up the Abrahamic banner, they then become the politics of God, the way to transform the world. Now, if you want 2 chapters on how Jeremiah dreams, Jeremiah's having a dream. And some interpreters even said it's God's dream. I gave a class years ago called God's Dream, where I used that verse. But if you look in Jeremiah 30 and 31, 30 and 31, those 2 chapters, there you've got the dream. And the dream is that there would be this holy nation, this treasured nation that would begin to reflect the words of the covenant. And then it's spoken of as a renewed covenant, not the covenant that was broken and cast aside by the double exiles and by really much of human history, but a new covenant in which people would come together and they would begin to reflect these values of this Abrahamic faith. So take a look at Schoenfield, the politics of God. He's not talking about any religion. He's not even talking about any certain nation, but he's talking about the ideal that the way the world gets fixed is by an example finally existing on the planet to which people can look and be drawn to and learn about. And that indeed is what you have in the prophets. In Isaiah 2, Micah 4, you have pictured a time when all the nations would go up to the mountain of the Lord. And what are they going to say? That he may teach us his ways and we may walk in his paths. Okay, teach us his ways. Well, what are the ways? I started with that. What are the ways of the Lord? What is the way of the Lord that Abraham was supposed to teach his children and his household, his wider household? Well, we've gone over them. You know, the principles are the very nature of God: to be gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and truth, and delighting in justice and righteousness, filling the earth. So those are the ways that they're going to learn, that these nations, and notice they're drawn. They say, come, let us go up and learn these things. That's the picture. It's pictured as a mountain that'll be exalted higher than any other mountain. Mountains are usually symbols of nations. And so this chosen nation, this servant nation, Israel. And remember, Israel can be used ethnically, it can be used for the country of Israel today, it could be used biologically when people talk about literal descent and they get into DNA and so forth. But it can also be used to talk about the collective group that gets the job done in terms of being the nation that takes up the call, the group of people who take up the call. And, Abrahamic faith is worldwide and broad, and it's open to anyone. So that's the fourth principle, is that all the nations are going to come up, and they're going to begin to want to learn from this servant nation. Isaiah 56 talks about this time, to use the prophet Isaiah, and it talks about strangers or foreigners who are really, no one would think were part of Israel or part of Judaism or even descendants of Abraham, but they're going to join themselves to Jehovah in this covenant, and they're going to keep the ways of Jehovah, and they're going to have a name better than sons and daughters. And so you get this idea of extending the plan. The prophets know about this, extending the plan. Jeremiah and Isaiah particularly talk about it, so that the nations come up. Finally, Isaiah 11 sees a time when this begins to bear fruit. And not only do you have the wolf lying with the lamb and the child playing on the poison den of an adder or poisonous snake or scorpion and all of that imagery, but you have the idea of no violence. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. And also that the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, of Jehovah. Notice the knowledge of knowing, that goes all the way back. What should you glory in or boast in? That you know me. So the earth would be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So all nations is the fourth principle. It's universal. It's for the whole world. Finally, the fifth thing, and this is where we see through a veil darkly. It's really hard to tell much about it, but we get hints at the end of Isaiah, particularly the last two chapters, Isaiah 65 and 66, that this is something that transcends any kind of geography. Starts out, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What is the house you will build for me? This is God speaking, or Jehovah, first person. To this human or man will I look, to him who is of a humble and contrite heart and trembles at my word, as if the individual person is now going to become the vessel or vehicle for representing the temple or holiness or religion, or what people think of as religion in our world today. And as you read through those chapters, you begin to get language about a new creation, a new heavens and a new earth. Now, there's all ways of interpreting that. Some people want to go into a world to come, a world beyond this world that we call the physical world, the world of death and sin and suffering and violence and chaos and so forth. Others see it as fixing the world, this world coming into its potential, into its perfection, not a magical solution that would be in another world or some apocalyptic rescue from the skies coming and just automatically making everything okay, which is the view that you begin to find in various Second Temple Jewish literature. And apocalypticism is the idea that God will suddenly come and straighten everything out and it'll all be made perfect. But in Isaiah 65 and 66, this new heaven and new earth creation begins to talk and describe a time that sounds very much like this world. It even mentions death. But then Isaiah 26, which is the most, I guess, mysterious chapter of Isaiah, there's this idea, 25, 26, that death could be swallowed up and death could maybe disappear, and that there would be this victory and this feast of all peoples. Sometimes it was later called the Messianic banquet and so forth. But I'm just going to call it a new creation. So Genesis 1 would be creation 1. This would be the new creation. But it seems to come from the old creation, as the old creation could develop into the new creation, and the old covenant or the first covenant could develop into the new covenant in which the plan would actually work. So if you put all of these together, who is God and what is the nature of God? What is the Abrahamic plan? And then how is that going to be implemented through the servant nation? And then how will that go to all the nations? And finally, how would the world become what it potentially could be? Then you've got basically the vision of the prophets. So I guess you could call it prophecy, but so many of those texts of the prophets seem to be conditional. If you return, turn to me and I will turn to you. You get that constantly. And if people are not turning, then what happens? And in the last of the Hebrew prophets, the book of Malachi, there is a chilling verse that says, if the fathers and the children's hearts don't turn to one another, which could be interpreted in various ways, generationally or whatever. But I think in context, it is talking about this very thing that I'm talking about in this class today. Lest, he goes on to say in Malachi, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Karam is the word, utter destruction. And you have to wonder, could that be brought on by human beings finally so disregarding these principles of justice and righteousness and truth and loving kindness and goodness and so forth? Could that come about because of what we do to each other, to the planet, and even to our corner, at least, of the solar system? It's kind of a chilling verse, lest I come. So the Elijah, the prophet, is supposed to come and restore all things. And whether that's seen as a figure, because it actually doesn't say Elijah spelled the way Elijah is in the historical portions of the Bible, but one who would say, my God is Jehovah, an Elijah like figure, Eliyahu, that he would come and preach this kind of thing. And if people don't respond, then the earth goes into chaos and void. That Yahweh did not create the earth to be a chaotic void, but to be inhabited. But could the earth become a chaotic void, if this politics of God, as Schoenfield called it, does not really succeed, does not really operate? So I want to leave you with that. It's a personal enough message when people are reading the Hebrew Bible, people who believe in a creator, people who believe that the world could develop into the ideals that the Hebrew prophets set forth, that even the United Nations uses in the symbol of the Isaiah wall across from the flags of all the nations. Any individual can take up that cause. Notice the foreigner who lays hold of the Lord, not joins a religion, but lays hold of the Creator, YHVH, doing justice and righteousness, becomes one whose name is better than sons and daughters, and can become part of then this servant nation. So the prophets have dreams. I assume they're also the dreams of God, but I like that term. But you can wake up from a dream, and what Jeremiah says, I woke up from my dream and my spirit was refreshed. I hope that's true of some of us, that if we dream this dream, that it doesn't just become a failure, that it actually becomes something that gets implemented in the world. The Hebrew prophets are practical. They are telling us and exhorting us, particularly before the exile when it all fell apart, to take up this banner And the prophets after that offer it still. Malachi and Zechariah in both of them have the phrase, return to me and I will return to you. So I'm not talking about religion. I'm not talking about joining anything. I'm talking about people deep down deciding who is the creator God, what is the force of all forces like that we reflect with our own lives and children, and our own better angels, as Abraham Lincoln called it. What is that all about? So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. And it happens to be the Sabbath day, a good day to think about the politics of God.